Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The sun was a merciless god in the New Mexico sky, and the land below offered no prayers, only dust. For 5 years, since the silence of the grave had swallowed her husband, Arthur, Eliza Vance had learned the rhythms of this unforgiving world. It was a rhythm of grit, sweat, and the lonely ache in her bones. The precious water sloshing in her bucket was her only victory against the crushing heat when she saw him, a broken shape against the baked earth. He was Apache, barely a man, with the fletching of a broken arrow jutting from his thigh. Arthur's final warning, a ghost on the wind, hissed in her ear, "They are not like us, Eliza. Their ways are blood." But her feet, guided by an instinct older than grief, drew her closer. As she knelt, her hand reaching for the faint, stubborn pulse at his neck, her fingers brushed against something hard and cool. It was a pendant of polished red quartz, the exact type of stone that had been Arthur's obsession, the very reason he was out in the canyons on the day he never came home. The world stopped. It wasn't just a wounded man at her feet, it was a specter from her past, a living, breathing mystery tied to her deepest wound. Just then, a faint tremor ran through the ground, the distant, unmistakable thunder of approaching horses. They were coming, and she was on her knees in the open, with a dying man who might be her husband's killer, holding the very clue she never knew she was looking for. What would you do? Flee from the ghosts of your past and the danger racing toward you, or embrace the one man who could hold the answers, even if it costs you everything? The choice Eliza Vance makes in the next 60 seconds will change the West forever. Stay with us, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, because the most dangerous frontiers are always the ones within the human heart. Part 1. A Debt in Crimson. Time fractured. The thunder of hooves in the distance was a closing fist, while the world immediately around Eliza Vance had shrunk to the space of a single, ragged breath. Her fingers, stained with dust and the grime of hard living, were still numb from the cold shock of the red quartz. It was Arthur's stone. The ghost of his laughter, the memory of his hands tracing its veins on a map, the hollow echo of his absence, it all crashed down on her in a single, suffocating wave. But the man at her feet, the Apache, let out a low groan, a sound that was pure, animal pain, and it sliced through her paralysis. He was dying. He might be a monster, a shadow connected to her own personal darkness, but he was a dying man. And in this land that had already taken her husband, her hope, and her youth, she would not let it claim another soul on her watch. Not like this. With a strength born of fury and a desperation she hadn't felt in years, Eliza looped her arms under his shoulders. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. "You better be worth it," she gritted out, the words a harsh whisper against the rising wind. Every step was a battle. Her worn leather boots slipped on the loose scree, and his dead weight threatened to pull them both down. The cabin, her solitary fortress, seemed a mile away, its windows like vacant eyes watching her struggle. She didn't dare look back toward the sound of the approaching riders. To look back was to hesitate, and to hesitate was to die. She focused on the splintered wood of her own porch, the warped boards a testament to her own endurance. She would not break. Not today. She half-dragged, half-carried him across the threshold just as the riders crested the nearby ridge, 7 menacing silhouettes against the bleeding sun. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound of the bolt sliding home a defiant crack in the vast silence. She pulled aside a threadbare rug, revealing the heavy cellar hatch. The cool, earthy smell of damp soil and stored roots rose to greet her, the scent of secrets. With her last ounce of strength, she eased him down into the darkness, his body thudding softly onto the packed dirt floor below. She tossed down a canteen and a roll of bandages before slamming the hatch, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. Only then did she grab the Winchester rifle from its hooks by the door, its familiar weight a cold comfort in her trembling hands. She took her position by the window, a sliver of glass to watch the world that was coming to tear hers apart. The 7 riders thundered into her yard, their horses kicking up plumes of angry dust. Jedediah Kane was at their head, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun too long. He pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes, small and sharp as a pig's, methodically scanning every detail of her property: the sagging porch, the patched roof, the pitiful vegetable garden. His gaze wasn't that of a lawman, it was the gaze of an appraiser. He dismounted, his spurs jingling a predatory tune. "Eliza," he called out, his voice a gravelly drawl that feigned civility. "Mighty long way from civilization for a woman all alone. You see which way he went?" Apache Buck shot up and running, scared. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester held loosely at her side, its muzzle pointed at the ground, but ready. "I see 7 men trespassing on my land, Kane. That's all I see." Kane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. The other men, a rough collection of hard-faced drifters, shifted in their saddles. Only one, a younger man named Silas, had the decency to look uneasy, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if wishing he were anywhere else. "Now, Eliza, there's no need for that kind of talk," Kane said, taking a step closer. "We're just a posse, helping the territory stay clean. We tracked him right to this little valley of yours. A man could get lost out here. A man could find things, too, if he knew where to look." His eyes flicked past her, toward the dry creek bed and the rocky hills beyond. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible glance, but Eliza saw it. He wasn't just hunting a man. He was scouting. "There's no one here," she said, her voice flat and cold as a river stone. "Just a widow who wants to be left alone. Now get off my property." Kane's smile vanished. "I knew your husband," he said, his voice dropping low. "Arthur was a good man, a dreamer, always chasing rocks and shadows. This land, it swallows dreamers whole. It'd be a shame for it to swallow his widow, too, all on account of a misplaced sense of charity." The threat was no longer veiled. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the dust. Behind Kane, Silas shifted again, clearing his throat. "Jedediah," the boy began, "maybe she's right. Maybe he passed through." "Quiet, boy," Kane snapped without turning his head. He held Eliza's gaze. "I'll ask you one more time. Did you see him?" The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Eliza thought of the man in her cellar, of the red stone still warm from his skin. She thought of Arthur's empty chair, of the 5 years of ghosts. She had been a victim of this land long enough. Now, she would be its defender. She raised the Winchester until it was level with her hip, the movement fluid and certain. "And I'll tell you one more time," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. "Get off My land. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died down. The horses stood frozen. Kane stared at her, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by a grudging respect, and then by pure, cold malice. He held her stare for a beat longer, then slowly raised his hands in mock surrender and backed away. "Have it your way, Vance," he spat, swinging himself back into the saddle. "But this land has a long memory. And so do I." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following like a pack of hounds called off a scent. Silas was the last to leave, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met Eliza's. In them, she saw not malice, but shame. Then he too was gone, swallowed by the dust. Eliza stood on the porch until the last echo of hoofbeats faded, the rifle still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Only when she was completely alone did she allow her body to tremble, the adrenaline leaving her weak and hollow. She bolted the door again and leaned against it, her forehead pressed to the rough wood. Her breath came in ragged sobs, for the fear she had suppressed, for the husband she still mourned, for the impossible choice she had just made. After a moment, she pushed herself upright. The crisis was over, but the problem lay beneath her feet. Lighting a lantern, she unbolted the heavy hatch and descended the rickety ladder into the cool dark. Talon lay where she had left him, his breathing shallow. The smell of blood was sharp in the enclosed space. She knelt beside him, the lantern casting their shadows long and dancing on the damp earthen walls. She had to deal with the arrow. Gently, carefully, she cut away the blood-stiffened leather of his breeches. The wound was ugly, the flesh around the arrowhead swollen and dark. But her eyes were drawn again to the red quartz pendant resting against his collarbone. It seemed to pulse with a light of its own in the flickering lamplight. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, a link to her past, a threat to her future. Her hands, which had been so steady holding a rifle against 7 men, now shook as she reached for a clean rag. Who was this man? What debt had she just paid on his behalf, and what would be the cost? The questions hung in the darkness of the cellar, unanswered and terrifying. Part 2. Whispers in the Cellar. The darkness of the cellar was a world unto itself, thick with the scent of damp earth, stored potatoes, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. For 2 days, Eliza had existed in a state of suspended reality, moving between the harsh, sun-bleached world above and the shadowed sanctuary below. The man, the Apache, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, his muttered words a language she couldn't comprehend, but whose pain she understood universally. The arrow had to come out. She knew this with the grim certainty of someone who had seen infection's poison creep through a body before. Her father, a field surgeon who had seen too much in the war, had taught her the brutal arithmetic of survival. Sometimes, to save a life, you had to invite the pain in, welcome it like a guest, and then cut it out at the root. She boiled the smallest of her kitchen knives, its edge sharpened on Arthur's old whetstone until it gleamed. She gathered clean rags, a bottle of whiskey, and the thread and needle she used for mending canvas. Down in the cellar, by the wavering light of a single lantern, she looked at the man lying on the cot. His eyes were open, lucid for the first time, and they followed her every move. There was no fear in them, only a deep, wary intelligence. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in her hands. "I have to cut it out." He said nothing, but gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. She handed him a thick piece of leather. "Bite down on this." He took it without hesitation. The procedure was a gruesome, intimate dance. Her hands, usually calloused and sure from farm work, had to be precise. She poured a generous amount of whiskey over the wound, and his entire body went rigid, a low hiss escaping through his clenched teeth, but he made no other sound. With the tip of the knife, she began to cut, following the grain of the wood, widening the wound to free the barbed metal head. The lantern light cast their magnified shadows on the wall, a grotesque tableau of healer and patient, captor and captive. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the dust. At one point, his eyes, dark and full of a pain she could barely imagine, met hers. In that moment, something shifted. He wasn't just an Apache, an enemy, a mystery. He was a man, placing his life in the hands of his captor, and the weight of that trust was heavier than his body had been to carry. With a final, sickening scrape, the arrowhead came free. She dropped it into a metal basin with a clatter, then worked quickly, cleaning the wound again, her stitches small and even, just as her father had taught her. When it was done, she slumped back on her heels, exhausted. He spat the leather from his mouth, his chest heaving. "My thanks," he rasped, the words rough but clear. His English was accented, but understandable. Eliza blinked, surprised. "You speak English?" He nodded again, a flicker of something, pride, perhaps, in his eyes. "I am Talon." The name seemed to fill the small space. It had weight. "Eliza," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. The silence that followed was different, no longer just an absence of noise, but a shared space. Her suspicion hadn't vanished. The red quartz pendant, which she had removed and placed on a crate, seemed to watch them from the shadows, but it was now complicated by a fragile thread of connection. While Eliza tended to her prisoner-turned-patient, Jedediah Kane made camp in a box canyon 2 miles away. The mood among his men was sour. They had come for a quick, violent satisfaction, not a waiting game. Silas found Kane by the fire, staring into the flames as if divining a map within them. "We should go, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "There was nothing there. She's just a stubborn woman on a worthless plot of land." Kane looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "There's no such thing as a worthless plot of land, boy. Only men with worthless eyes." He took a swig from a flask. "You see dust and rock. I see a future. The transcontinental is pushing through Arizona. They'll need a spur line north, and that spur line will need water, more than any damn creek can provide. Old Man Hemlock's geological surveys, the ones Arthur Vance was helping him with before he met his end, spoke of a deep aquifer in this valley. A river under the sand. Find that, you don't just own a ranch. You own the whole territory." Silas was stunned. "So this isn't about the Apache?" "The Apache is the excuse," Kane sneered. "He's the righteous fire that lets me burn out anyone in my way. His people know this land. They know where the water is. Once I have him, he'll tell me. And that woman, Vance's widow, she's sitting right on top of the best place to sink a well. I gave her a chance to walk away. She chose to be stubborn. Now she'll be a casualty." The cold, calculated greed in his voice made Silas's blood run cold. This wasn't justice. It was a land grab, painted in blood and sanctimony. He thought of Eliza's face, her defiance, and felt a profound sense of shame. He was on the wrong side of this fight. Back at the cabin, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Eliza was in her kitchen, making a thin broth, when she felt it first, a change in the air, a stillness that was deeper than the usual evening quiet. The crickets had stopped chirping. The wind held its breath. She moved to the window, her hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester. At first, she saw nothing. The landscape was empty, bathed in the twilight. Then she saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. Not a deer. A shadow detaching itself from other shadows. She squinted, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Another shadow moved on the ridge to her left. Then another, by the dry creek bed. They weren't riding. They weren't charging. They were materializing. Apache warriors, more than a dozen of them, emerging from the land as if born from it. They were on foot, armed with rifles and bows, their movements economical and silent. They didn't approach the cabin. Instead, they formed a wide, loose circle around her property, each warrior finding a position of cover behind a rock outcropping, within a thicket of mesquite, at the crest of a hill. At their head, standing on a promontory 100 yards away, was an older man with braids streaked in silver. His posture was one of absolute authority. He carried himself not like a raider, but like a king surveying his domain. It was Black Hawk. Eliza didn't need to know his name to understand who he was. This wasn't an attack. It was a vigil, a silent, unblinking statement. They knew their man was here, and they would not leave without him. They were a jury, waiting for a verdict. Eliza backed away from the window, her breath catching in her throat. She was trapped. In the distance, she could just make out the faint, mocking glow of Jedediah Kane's campfire. In the foreground, surrounding her home on all sides, was a circle of silent, patient warriors. And beneath her feet, in the dark, lay the man at the center of it all. The whispers in the cellar had ended, replaced by a profound, terrifying silence that pressed in on her from all sides. Part 3. The Siege of Wills. The days that followed bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, etched in silence and suspicion. Time was no longer measured by the sun's arc across the sky, but by the shifting of shadows on the canyon wall, shadows that had names and carried rifles. Eliza learned the geography of her prison yard. There was a warrior perched on the granite outcropping to the east, his silhouette as motionless as the rock itself. Another was concealed in the thicket of mesquite by the creek, visible only by the occasional, predatory glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. They were a constant, unnerving presence, their patience a weapon more potent than any arrow. Inside the cabin, a different kind of siege was taking place. The small space vibrated with unspoken words. Talon was growing stronger. The fever had broken, and the wound, while still angry, was clean. He was now able to sit up on the cot, his back against the cool earthen wall. He watched her with an intensity that was both unnerving and, strangely, reassuring. It was the look of a guardian, not a prisoner. They spoke little, their conversations clipped and practical. Water. More wood for the fire. The dressing needs to be changed. Yet, in these small exchanges, a silent language was being forged. She learned that a slight narrowing of his eyes meant pain, that a tilt of his head was a question. He learned that the tight set of her jaw meant she was worried, and that the brisk, efficient way she moved was a shield for the fear she refused to show. The red quartz pendant sat on the crate between them, a silent arbiter of the chasm that still separated their worlds. Sometimes she would catch him looking at it, his expression unreadable, and the cold knot of suspicion would tighten in her gut. Arthur's ghost was a third resident in that cellar, and his silence was the loudest of all. The pressure from Kane's camp was different, more insidious. They remained out of rifle range, a mocking presence. Sometimes a rider would gallop along the ridge, a clear display of force. Once, they left the carcass of a deer just beyond her property line, a gift for the buzzards, a clear message of what they thought of her and her ward. It was a war of nerves, and Eliza felt her own begin to fray. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares of fire and whispers, and the accusing eyes of her dead husband. On the morning of the fourth day, the stalemate broke. A lone figure detached itself from the rocks and walked toward the cabin. It was Black Hawk. He moved with an unhurried grace, his hands empty, his posture radiating an authority that needed no weapon to enforce. Eliza met him on the porch, her Winchester held ready, but not aimed. They stood 20 paces apart, two sovereigns surveying the borders of their tiny, warring nations. "You have sheltered our blood," Black Hawk began, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily on the still morning air. His English was formal, learned from treaties and broken promises. "He is Talon, son of my sister. The honor of our people demands his return." "He's not well enough to travel," Eliza stated, her voice betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "His leg is healing, but he is weak." "We will carry him," Black Hawk replied, his gaze unwavering. "He will heal faster with his own kind, under his own sky. You have done a brave thing, a strange thing, but your part in this is over. Give him to us." Eliza's mind raced. To give him up was the sensible choice. It would end the siege. The Apache would leave. Kane would lose his excuse. But it felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of the trust she had seen in Talon's eyes when she cut the arrow from his flesh. A betrayal of her own stubborn, inexplicable decision to save him in the first place. "He is not a sack of grain to be handed over," she said, her grip tightening on the rifle. "He's a man. When he is ready to leave, he will leave. Not before." A murmur went through the watching warriors on the hills. Black Hawk's expression hardened. "You are one woman, in a wooden house. You speak of choice as if you have one. You are standing in the path of a river, and you will be swept away. Give us our blood." Before Eliza could answer, a new sound cut through the tension, the sharp, hungry crackle of fire. A pillar of oily black smoke began to rise from the far side of her property. Her barn. The small, rickety structure where she kept her tools and the last of Arthur's geological equipment was ablaze. A flicker of orange flame licked at the dry timber, growing with terrifying speed. Through the smoke, she could see two riders, Kane's men, galloping back toward their camp, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. It was a provocation. A cruel, calculated act to force her hand, to draw the Apache into a fight. But for Eliza, it was something more. It was a moment of horrifying clarity. The smoke burned her eyes, but it cleared her mind. She saw the charred remains of her fence, the ashes of her husband's dreams, the relentless, consuming greed of Jedediah Kane. He wouldn't stop with the barn. He wouldn't stop until he had burned her out, erased her from this land, just as it had erased Arthur. Hiding in the cellar, protecting one man, waiting for the threat to pass. It was a fool's hope. She had been reacting, surviving, enduring. But survival was no longer enough. The fire had burned away the victim in her. She was no longer just a widow on a desolate plot of land. She was the last line of defense. The world tilted on its axis. Her goal was no longer to simply protect Talon. Her goal was to destroy Jedediah Cain. The fear that had been her constant companion for 5 years was replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like steel solidifying in her veins. She turned her back on the burning barn, a monument to her past life, and faced Black Hawk. The Apache chief was watching her, his expression a mixture of surprise and calculation. He had expected tears, panic. He did not expect the woman who now stood before him. "He wants a war," Eliza said, her voice low and dangerous, devoid of all its earlier softness. "He thinks he can use you to start it, to clean this valley of anyone who stands in his way." She took a step forward, off the porch and onto the dirt of her yard, claiming it. "You spoke of honor. Is it honorable to be a pawn in a white man's greedy game? Is it honorable to let him burn out a woman who has shown your blood more kindness than his own people?" She pointed a finger, not at Black Hawk, but at the valley itself. "This is my land. Arthur Vance is buried here. My sweat is in this soil. The man in my cellar is under my protection. I will not give him to you, and I will not yield this ground to Cain. You say I am standing in the path of a river. Then the river will have to go around me, or it will have to break against me." It was an insane declaration, a declaration of sovereignty from a nation of one. She was no longer a pawn between two kings. She had just crowned herself queen. Black Hawk stared at her, his ancient eyes seeing past the sun-worn dress and the rifle, seeing the unbending will beneath. He saw the fire in her eyes and knew it burned hotter and more fiercely than the flames consuming her barn. He did not agree. He did not disagree. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. He had come to confront a frightened settler. He had found an equal. The siege of wills had just truly begun, and its battlefield was now the heart of Eliza Vance. Part 4. An Alliance of Scars. The smell of burning pine was a bitter incense in the air, a funeral pyre for the life Eliza Vance once knew. The barn was a skeletal ruin, its blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Yet, as Eliza descended the ladder back into the cellar, she felt no grief for it. The fire had cauterized a wound she hadn't known was still bleeding. She was no longer a woman mourning a past. She was a woman defending a future, however small and precarious that future might be. Talon was sitting up when she entered, his posture alert. He had heard everything, her defiant shouts, the crackle of the flames, the heavy silence that followed. His dark eyes searched her face, not with the passive curiosity of a patient, but with the keen assessment of a fellow warrior. He saw the change in her. The fear had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, brighter. She was no longer just his savior, she was his ally. Without a word, she walked to the crate where the red quartz pendant lay. The fire in the lantern seemed to gather in its polished depths, making it look like a single, solidified drop of blood. She picked it up. It felt heavy in her palm, heavy with the weight of 5 years of unanswered questions. She turned and held it out to him, her gaze as sharp and unyielding as the arrowhead she had pulled from his flesh. "Arthur Vance," she said, her voice low and steady. "My husband. He was a geologist. He was searching for this stone, in these canyons, on the day he was killed. They said it was an Apache raid. They said a lot of things." She let the silence hang between them, thick and suffocating. "Now, you tell me. You tell me how his stone of obsession ended up around your neck." A storm of emotions passed across Talon's face: surprise, understanding, and a deep, weary sadness. He had seen the suspicion in her eyes from the beginning, but now he understood its source. It wasn't just the color of his skin, it was the ghost she saw standing behind him. He gestured for her to sit, a silent invitation to hear a story he had never intended to tell. "The stone is not for taking," he began, his English careful, each word chosen with deliberation. "It is a guardian. It belongs to the people, to the land. It marks a place of power, a place where the spirits of the mountain drink." He spoke of the land not as a thing to be owned, but as a living entity. "Your husband, Arthur. He was not like the others. The others came with loud voices and iron tools that scarred the earth. They saw only what they could take. He came with quiet eyes. He watched the birds, the flow of the water. He touched the rocks as if listening to them." Talon described a cautious, unspoken understanding that had formed between him, a silent guardian of his ancestral land, and Arthur, a quiet student of it. They had watched each other from a distance for weeks, two men from different worlds sharing a reverence for the same patch of dirt. "One day," Talon continued, his voice dropping lower, "he found the place of the stone. I was watching. He did not try to take it. He sketched it in his book. He touched it once, with respect. He understood it was not his. The memory brought a flicker of warmth to his eyes, the memory of a potential friend. But then his expression darkened. Then, Cain's men came. Not the boy, Silas. The others. They had followed your husband. They spoke of water. They said Arthur knew where the deep water was, and they offered him gold for this knowledge." Talon's fists clenched. Arthur refused. He told them this land was not for sale, that some things should be left alone. Cain's men, they are not men who like the word no. They argued. They pushed him. He fought back. He was a brave man, your Arthur. But he was one, and they were four. The truth, when it came, was a brutal, simple thing. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't a clash of cultures. It was murder, plain and simple, born of greed. "They shot him," Talon said, his voice raw. "They took his books, his maps. I was hidden. I could do nothing. It would have been my death against theirs. When they left, I went to him. He was already gone. I took the stone guardian, not as a trophy, but to protect it, to keep it from their filthy hands. It has been my burden since that day." Eliza listened, her body rigid, as the final, missing pieces of her life's great, tragic puzzle slotted into place. The story made a terrible kind of sense. The way Cain had looked at her land, his talk of dreamers being swallowed whole, his relentless obsession. It was all connected. The immense weight of her suspicion lifted, only to be replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. She looked at Talon, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not an Apache, not a killer, not a stranger, but a fellow survivor. A man who had witnessed her husband's last moments, who had carried a piece of that tragedy with him. The scars they both carried, one on his thigh, the other on her soul, had been carved by the same hand. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It was a baptism, washing away the last of the poison. His name was Arthur, she whispered, a final eulogy. Talon reached out, not to touch her, but holding his hand open in a gesture of shared grief. His name was Arthur, he repeated softly, honoring the man he had known only by his quiet eyes. The cellar was no longer a prison. It had become a sanctuary, a place of confession and absolution. The alliance between them was no longer one of convenience. It was forged in the fire of a shared enemy and sealed with the truth of a shared loss. For the first time in 5 years, Eliza was not alone in her grief. Later, after the silence had settled into a comfortable quiet, she tended to his wound again. Her touch was different now, gentle, sure, without the hesitation of a stranger. He watched her, his gaze full of a new, profound respect. "Cain will not stop," she said, breaking the silence. It was not a question. He will come back. With more men. He will not leave until he has what he wants, or until we are all dead. Talon nodded. He wants the water. And he wants me, because he thinks I can lead him to it. Then we cannot wait for him to come to us, Eliza declared, the strategist in her fully awakened. We have to change the battlefield. Hiding here is a death sentence. They began to talk, their voices low and urgent, their minds working as one. He had the knowledge of the land, of every canyon, game trail, and hidden spring. She had her husband's memory, the fragments of maps he had drawn, his understanding of the rock formations. They pieced it together. Arthur hadn't just been looking for rocks. He had been charting the fault lines, looking for the telltale signs of the aquifer Cain was so desperate to find. Their plan began to form, a desperate, audacious gamble. There was a series of narrow, box canyons a mile north of the cabin, the very place Arthur had been killed. According to his old notes, the rock walls there were notoriously unstable. "A rock slide," Eliza whispered, the idea taking shape. If we could block the main canyon pass, it would cut off his easiest route to the highlands where the aquifer is strongest. It would buy us time. It might even convince the railroad that the route is too dangerous. It would take a great force to move that much rock, Talon cautioned. We don't have a great force, Eliza said, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. But Arthur found something else out there. He found a seam of black powder coal, soft and volatile. He told me a single, well-placed charge could bring down half the mountain. It was an all-or-nothing plan. It would require them to leave the relative safety of the cabin and venture out into the open, right into the territory Cain was watching. But it was a proactive strike, a way to fight back on their own terms. It was a plan born of two scarred people, a fusion of his ancient wisdom and her inherited knowledge. It was their only hope. We will need a diversion, Talon said, his eyes gleaming with a strategic fire that matched her own. To draw them south, while we go north. He began to speak, and Eliza listened, two generals planning a war from a cellar, with nothing but their scars, their wits, and a shared desire for justice. Part 5. Where all rivers run red. The night before was a crucible of whispered plans and silent prayers. Under the sliver of a moon, Talon had slipped away from the cabin, melting into the landscape that had birthed him. He moved not like a man, but like a current of air, a shadow with a purpose. His task was the diversion. Hours later, a ferocious orange glow bloomed against the southern horizon, miles from their true destination. Talon had found a dry riverbed choked with dead timber and tumbleweeds, a natural fuse leading to a dense thicket of arid grass. The resulting fire was a spectacle of calculated chaos, a roaring beast that would draw the eyes and horses of Jedediah Cain's men, a false flag planted in the heart of the darkness. As the distant glow pulsed like a dying sun, Eliza helped Talon, now returned and moving with a pained stiffness, prepare for the true mission. They carried what was left of Arthur's supplies: a small keg of volatile black powder, a long fuse, and his hand-drawn map, its creases as familiar to Eliza as the lines on her own hands. They moved north, under the cloak of pre-dawn twilight, every step a gamble. The world was a symphony of threats, the snap of a twig, the cry of a hunting owl, the whisper of the wind, each sound a potential death knell. Talon, despite his injury, was their guide, his instincts a compass more true than any magnetic needle. He led them through game trails and shallow arroyos, his movements a testament to a lifetime of evading notice. Eliza, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, followed close behind, the heavy keg digging into her shoulder, her Winchester a permanent extension of her arm. They were two ghosts moving through a haunted land, their shared purpose the only thing keeping the terror at bay. They reached the box canyon as the first pale fingers of dawn clawed at the eastern sky. It was a place of grim majesty, the rock walls rising on either side like monolithic tombstones. A profound silence hung in the air, the kind that precedes both creation and destruction. This was where Arthur had died. Eliza could feel it, a cold spot in the air, a lingering echo of his final, desperate moments. Using Arthur's map, they found the spot. A deep fissure in the canyon wall, and behind it, a seam of soft, glistening black coal. It was just as Arthur had described. The air smelled of sulfur and ancient stone. Planting the charge was painstaking, nerve-shredding work. Talon stood guard, his rifle sweeping the canyon entrance, while Eliza, her hands surprisingly steady, packed the powder deep into the fissure, her movements precise and economical. She worked the fuse into the keg, her mind a cold, clear machine focused on a single task. There was no room for grief, no time for fear. There was only the plan. But Jedediah Cain was a wolf, not a stray dog. He had seen the fire in the south, and for a time he had been drawn to it. But as his men charged toward the blaze, a cold sliver of doubt entered his mind. It was too easy, too theatrical. It was a trick. Leaving the bulk of his posse to chase the flames, he, Silas, and another hardened gunman named Hewitt had doubled back, circling around to the north. Cain remembered the talk of the unstable canyons from Arthur's stolen notes. He knew where they were going. The sound of a dislodged pebble, skittering down the canyon wall, was their only warning. Eliza looked up from the fuse, her blood turning to ice. 3 figures stood at the canyon's mouth, blocking their only escape. Jedediah Cain sat astride his horse, a triumphant, predatory sneer twisting his lips. "Well, well," Cain drawled, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Look what we have here. The widow and the savage, playing with fire. Did you really think it would be that easy?" Talon moved to stand in front of Eliza, his body a shield, but the open ground offered no cover. They were trapped. "It's over, Cain!" Eliza shouted, her voice defiant. "Your game is up. I know what you did to my husband." Cain's amusement soured into pure malice. "Your husband was a fool who stood in the way of progress. Just like you," he spat. He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Eliza's chest. "You see, this is my valley now, my water, my future, and I will not have it soiled by the likes of you. Hewitt, kill the savage. Silas, the woman is yours. Make it clean." The moment froze. Hewitt raised his rifle. Silas, his face pale as death, lifted his own pistol, his hand trembling. His eyes met Eliza's, and in them she saw a war being fought and lost. "I can't," Silas whispered, the words barely audible. "Jedediah, this ain't right." "You sentimental little coward," Cain roared, turning his attention to Silas for a fatal second. "If you won't do it, It was the opening they needed. Talon threw the knife from his belt with blinding speed, a silver blur that buried itself in Hewitt's shoulder. The man screamed, his rifle shot going wide, splintering rock far above their heads. In that same instant, as Cain swung his pistol back toward Eliza, Silas made his choice. He didn't fire at Eliza. He fired at the rock face just beside Cain's head. The shot was a deliberate miss, a desperate act of rebellion. The bullet ricocheted with a piercing whine, forcing Cain to flinch and spoiling his aim. Chaos erupted. Talon charged the wounded Hewitt, their bodies crashing together in a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Cain, enraged by Silas's betrayal, fired at the boy, catching him in the leg. Silas cried out and crumpled to the ground. Eliza didn't hesitate. She scrambled toward the fuse, a lit match flaring in her hand. Cain saw her and spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of pure fury. He was on her in seconds, leaping from the saddle, his heavy body slamming into her and knocking her to the dust. The match was extinguished. His hands were at her throat, his thumbs pressing down, stealing the air from her lungs. "I'm going to enjoy this," he hissed, his face inches from hers. But Eliza was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She clawed at his face, her nails digging for his eyes. As he recoiled, she drove her knee hard into his groin. He howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough. She squirmed out from under him, grabbing a fist-sized rock. As he lunged for her again, she brought it down on the side of his head with all her strength. He staggered back, stunned, blood matting his hair. In the background, Talon had finished his fight, Hewitt lying still on the canyon floor. He was now limping toward her, but he was too far. This was her fight. "It's over, Cain," she panted, scrambling back to the fuse, striking another match. "You lose." Cain let out a roar of pure, animalistic rage and charged her one last time. But he was slower now, his movements clumsy. She sidestepped his clumsy tackle, held the flame to the fuse, and watched as the spark caught, hissing as it disappeared into the rock. It was done. The fuse was lit. Talon reached her, grabbing her arm. "Eliza, we have to go. Now." They half ran, half stumbled toward the mouth of the canyon, Talon dragging the wounded Silas with them. Cain, realizing what she had done, stood frozen for a second in disbelief, then turned to run. But it was too late. A low, deep rumble started from within the mountain, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. The rumble became a deafening roar. Cracks spiderwebbed across the canyon walls. The ground shook violently. Cain looked up, his face a mask of terror, as the entire side of the mountain seemed to peel away. The rock slide was not a cascade of stones. It was an avalanche of entire cliff faces, a geological cataclysm. Boulders the size of cabins tumbled end over end, crashing down with unimaginable force. Jedediah Cain let out one final, terrified scream before he was consumed, erased from existence by the very land he had sought to conquer. Eliza, Talon, and Silas just cleared the canyon's entrance as the wall of dust and debris billowed out, the shockwave knocking them from their feet. They lay on the ground, gasping for air, as the thunderous noise slowly subsided, replaced by the trickling sound of settling rock. The dust began to clear, revealing a new landscape. The canyon pass was gone. In its place was a mountain of freshly broken rock, a tombstone for a greedy man, sealing the valley forever. They had won. Battered, bleeding, and exhausted, they had won. Part 6. Forged in Snow. The silence that followed the mountain's roar was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of finality, of a chapter slammed shut with the force of a geological age. Dust, thick and chalky, settled like a shroud over the newly formed landscape, turning the morning air into a hazy twilight. In that quiet, there were only 3 heartbeats. Eliza pushed herself to her knees, her body a single, throbbing ache. Nearby, Talon was already on his feet, his face a grim mask of pain and determination as he limped toward Silas. The boy was conscious, his face pale with shock, his teeth gritted against the agony in his leg, where Cain's bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. There were no words of victory, no cries of triumph. They had survived, but the cost was written in the blood soaking Silas's trouser leg and in the deep, weary lines etched onto their faces. The first task was the one of the living. Survival. With a quiet efficiency born of shared trauma, they worked together. Eliza, tearing a strip from her petticoat, expertly fashioned a tourniquet, her hands moving with the sure, practiced motions her father had taught her. Talon, using his knife, cut splints from a fallen branch, his movements economical despite the fire in his own wounded leg. Silas, for his part, endured it all with a stoicism that spoke of a boy forced to become a man in the crucible of a single, violent morning. He had made his choice, and this was the price. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage. They took turns supporting Silas, their progress measured in inches of pain. When the cabin finally came into view, scarred, its barn a blackened skeleton, but still standing, it looked less like a home and more like a relic from another life. Standing before it, a silent, solemn council, were Black Hawk and his warriors. They had seen the fire, heard the mountain's fury, and had waited. They knew a war had been fought and won. Black Hawk's gaze fell upon the trio, taking in their ragged state. The blood, the exhaustion, the strange alliance of a white woman, an Apache warrior, and a wounded boy from the enemy camp. His eyes, ancient and wise, understood more than words could say. He looked at the sealed canyon in the distance, then back at them. The land itself had passed judgment. He stepped forward, not with the authority of a chief demanding tribute, but with the quiet dignity of a man offering sanctuary. "The path behind you is closed," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your home is a memory. Cain's world will not forgive what you have done here. They will hunt you." He paused, his eyes resting on Eliza. "Our path leads west, to the high country, where the air is clean and men like Cain cannot follow. There is a place for you among us. A place for all of you." He included Silas in his gesture, an act of grace that was as surprising as it was profound. Eliza looked at the cabin, at the small, crude wooden cross that marked Arthur's grave. She had fought for this land, bled for it. But it was a land of ghosts. Her life here was over. To stay was to wait for another Cain, another Posse, another tide of greed to wash over her. She looked at Talon, who stood beside her, his presence a silent, unwavering promise. She looked at Silas, a boy who had earned his redemption in blood. Her home wasn't this patch of dirt anymore. Her home was this fragile, broken circle of survivors. "We will come," she said, her voice clear and certain. They left that afternoon, a small, weary caravan turning its back on the Valley of Ghosts. Eliza took one last look at Arthur's grave, whispering a final, silent goodbye. She was not abandoning him. She was finally honoring his memory by choosing to live. Their journey took them higher, into the rugged teeth of the mountains. The air grew thin and cold. The comfortable heat of the valley gave way to a biting wind that promised an early winter. And on their second day in the high passes, the promise was kept. The sky, a brilliant, clear blue only hours before, turned the color of slate. A few stray snowflakes, then a flurry, then a blinding, howling wall of white descended upon them. The blizzard was a living thing, a mindless, impartial force of nature that sought to strip the warmth and life from anything in its path. It was their final trial. Shelter was their only hope. Talon, his knowledge of the high country, now their most valuable asset, led them not to a cave, but to a cleverly hidden recess, a hollowed-out space behind a frozen waterfall, its entrance shielded by a curtain of ice. Inside, it was cramped and cold, but it was a reprieve from the wind's relentless assault. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. In that small, icy sanctuary, their new family was truly forged. The blizzard stripped away the last vestiges of who they had been, leaving only what they were. Human beings dependent on one another for survival. Rank and race were meaningless words in the face of a cold that leached the strength from one's bones. Eliza's medical knowledge became a blessing for all, as she tended not only to Silas and Talon, but to another warrior who had begun to suffer from frostbite. Talon, in turn, became their provider, his traps snaring 2 rabbits that had also sought shelter nearby, their meat providing precious warmth and strength. Silas, unable to walk, took on the task of keeping their small, smoky fire alive, a vital role that gave him purpose and paid his debt. It was in the small, quiet moments that their future was written. It was in the way Talon placed his own blanket over Eliza's shoulders as she slept, the way she would wordlessly pass him a cup of warm broth, the way Black Hawk would share stories of the stars with Silas, teaching him the constellations of his people. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Eliza sat close to the fire, watching Talon carefully mend a tear in his moccasin. His hands were strong, scarred, but his movements were gentle. He looked up, and their eyes met across the flickering flames. No words were spoken. No grand declarations were made. There was only a quiet, profound understanding. They had saved each other in more ways than one. He had saved her from a life of lonely grief, and she had saved him from a death of lonely vengeance. In the firelight, their shared scars were no longer signs of damage, but maps of the journey that had led them to each other. On the morning of the fourth day, they awoke to silence. The wind had died. A brilliant, pristine light filtered through the ice. When they emerged from their shelter, the world was transformed. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, reborn in white and silence. The snow had smoothed every harsh edge of the mountains, covering the world in a blanket of pure, unsullied peace. Below them, nestled in the cradle of the mountains, was a valley they had never seen. It was green, protected, with a river snaking through it like a ribbon of life. Smoke curled from the lodges of a small, peaceful encampment. They had arrived. As they stood on the precipice, looking down at their new home, Talon reached out and took Eliza's hand. His touch was warm, solid, real. She laced her fingers through his, her hand fitting into his as if it were always meant to be there. She was not Eliza Vance, the widow. He was not Talon, the hunted. They were simply Eliza and Talon, forged in fire, tested by blood, and now, finally, reborn in snow. The trail behind them was gone, buried. The trail ahead was clear. The story of Eliza Vance and Talon is more than just a tale of survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to choose compassion in the face of hatred, and to find love in the most unlikely of alliances. Their journey began with a single, dangerous act of kindness, a choice that unraveled a world of prejudice and greed, forcing them to confront the ghosts of their pasts. They were two solitary souls, scarred by loss and hardened by circumstance, who found in each other not just a reason to live, but a reason to build a new world together. Their story teaches us that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. It shows us that home is not a structure of wood and nails, but a sanctuary built from trust and mutual protection. In the end, they weren't defined by the sides they were born into, but by the side they chose, the side of humanity. They discovered that the most impassable canyons and the most brutal blizzards are no match for a love forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. Their trail ahead is unwritten, but for the first time, they will not walk it alone. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and a love as untamed as the frontier itself moved you, then you have found your tribe. What was the moment you knew Eliza would risk it all? What does true courage mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful love story, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of fierce hearts and forbidden love. Hit the notification bell, because the trail to true romance is always waiting to be explored, and you won't want to miss a single step.